Okay, welcome back to Lunch with Larry. Today we're going to talk about standards access. How do we set up our system to have these reuse libraries that trace between external standards and our internal standards, and then finally our product set? Appreciate you coming today and looking at our third of the different views or frameworks that we're going to use to analyze our requirement set. Again, it's Larry Sampson. This is my contact information. Feel free to register for the YouTube channel or send this design control registration link to anybody who's interested in some of these topics. Be happy to help you if the opportunity arises. Okay, so again, requirements managements are 1A. Requirements is the core data set that we relate everything else to. 1B is systems modeling. What is our understanding of the functional models and how do they relate to the requirements management? And today we're going to talk about standards management. How do these external standards map into our requirements management data set? Then we'll have verification and validation. What is our evidence that the device complies with our definition of good? And finally, risk management. What is our understanding? How do we process our requirements in the context of defining mitigations to problems that arise in the field? So what are we talking about? And I think it's really valuable to step back and say, how is it exactly we want to structure our different projects inside of a requirements management tool to provide us with the kind of traceability that we want? So it's one thing for me to say, hey, from an object standpoint, we have user needs and system requirements and design requirements, and they ought to be related in this way. That's sort of the data-centric view. But in addition to the data-centric view, layered on top of that is a document-centric view. And when I say documents, people think in terms of Word and a whole variety of different things. What a document is in Polarian is a container of work items with also free text and free content to provide context. And then what we can do is we can take that container and put it through a review cycle and approve it just like you would a requirement. So we kind of have the requirement data object level, and then we have the container level, and that's really what we call a document. So we want to talk not only about what is the logical relationship between the work items, but also what are these documents intended to do and how are we going to use them to drive reuse in our device design. So we have these three different libraries. We have an external standards library. Examples, I said in the last one, ISO 60601, 11135, or usability documents, or I used one that was transcatheter heart valve specific in one of the projects that I worked on. So essentially, these are external standards that put requirements on specific scopes of work where a committee sits down and says, whenever we do this activity in the future, we want to have learned from what we've done in the past and re-execute some of that work so we're not making mistakes that we have already solved in the past. And so that's what these external standards are for. Well, when you're doing a submission, one of the really nice shortcuts to a submission is not to create everything whole cloth, but to come in and say, look, there's standards out there that talk about how this is done, and we're going to follow the standard because we know that works, rather than trying to figure out a whole new methodology for everything that we're doing. That's really what this external standards library is. And when we create an external standard in the tool, what we're going to do is we're going to break it down by clause, and then we're going to trace those clauses into the requirements. Really important concept in this first step because those external standards oftentimes step on one another. And what I want is to be able to say in the normative library for a product type, how are we going to handle not only this clause in this standard, but also a similar clause written in a different standard and maybe a third clause written in a third standard. Where are we going to process which standard we're stepping on? Because they're not all identical. What this allows me to do at the normative library level is say exactly what I'm going to do and what is the justification for writing the requirement in this way in the context of these multiple standards and the different requirements that are laying on top of it. So it provides me with the space without impacting the project to have some understanding of how these external standards should be applied to a product type. So that's really important. And that gives us this atomic traceability between the external standards and the normative library standards so that I can have a way that the company has decided to process these external standards for a particular product type, be it pacemakers or syringes or whatever. Okay, so now that I have the set of requirements in the normative library, I can share those as a container down to the project. And so that's going to just provide this traceability one-to-one with the document that's shared to the project. And then what I can do is make modifications to the project project standard. So then I can take the project standard that is a document with the one-to-one traceability between the requirements and identical requirements between the normative library and the project standard. What that allows me to do then is delete things that are in the normative library if necessary, but also add things that are specific to this project only. And that way I can create these new requirements and understand what's happening in the new project and decide whether I want to move it back to the normative library to be shared to other projects in the future. So what this does is creates kind of a hub and spoke, and very important concept, because now you can see if I continue to share to the projects from the normative library, what that means is I have a 3-level traceability back to the external standards. It's always 3 levels. And if I do that, then I can run a report that basically says how a particular standard is compliant with a particular project and show that traceability. In addition to that, then I have test cases that are associated with those requirements and test results that are associated with the test cases. And now I can show the actual test case that shows compliance to the standard. And I can do that all at a click of a button. And people really struggle with this in companies because that traceability is usually built out in spreadsheets and it's not revision specific. So it's very difficult to understand what exactly has changed when a standard changes in the field. So what's missing in this process? We have all the functionality in Polarian to do this traceability from level to level, but we are missing certain components. And one of them is these external standards have legal agreements that don't allow you to create electronic copies of the PDFs. So one of the things we'd like to be able to do is have access to those standards in a way that doesn't create copyright problems. Another thing that's really missing in all this is this digital understanding of each clause and how each one of the clauses trace into the projects. That's critical so that the reporting gives us the kind of granularity that we want. And this system, as it's typically deployed in companies with documents, is incredibly slow. Usually what you'll end up with is a global process owner who gets assigned a standard for a product type, and there's usually more than one global process owner because you have different types of products in a company. And when a standard changes, usually what happens is they get an email that says, okay, what's the impact to all the products under your management for a change to the sterilization standard? So they have to go through, first of all, and figure out what's different, get a red line of the standard. Then they have to know what products are impacted by that revision of the standard, not any revision, that revision of the standard. And then they have to say, okay, well, what is the testing that would have to be done to bring all the other projects up to compliance? And in addition to that, usually you don't want to pull those requirements down at a cadence that makes sense to the new standard being released. You want to do it to when it makes sense for the project. So you want to pull them down to the project. You don't want to push them down. So this abstraction of these different levels is really important to making it fast so that I can say, okay, I have an external standard that's changed. Here's the normative documents that are affected. Here's where they're shared in one reporting structure, and then show the traceability. Okay, we have 15 tests that have to be redone. That's going to be X hours per test, and get a report that says what needs to be done to bring us back up into compliance. So very difficult process, and a few key pieces that are missing to do this well. So when I talked about a hub and spoke model, this is kind of what I talked about. When we do new projects, we have this traceability from the normative library to the external standards, and then from the normative library to the projects, each one of the projects. Reuse is accomplished through the library. It's not accomplished between projects. So those external standards are shared through the library. To make this point, if you start sharing between the projects, what happens is we have n levels of traceability. Now I have project to project to project, and I don't know for the 4th project how many levels I need to go through to figure out the traceability to the external standards. So that reporting between external standards and the project becomes n levels deep. And it makes it almost impossible for us to really understand the relationship between the external standard and the project. So what standards access does is it provides us with this external standard broken down. And that external standard, I just want to mention this because I've done this several different ways. What makes the most sense is for us to have one work item type for the external standards. So those clauses are each defined by one work item type, and then we trace them into the normative library broken down just like we do it in the projects. So in one of the previous discussions, I talked about this requirements decomposition. We want that requirements decomposition between the normative library and the projects to be identical, and that will allow us to have direct traceability back through the normative library to the standard clauses. We don't want to have between the projects and the normative library differences in traceability and the definition, because then that traceability between those two projects is going to get messed up. So we want to make sure that the normative library and the projects are the same if we want to have this kind of reporting. So just to provide you with a little bit of a discussion about what we have in an application, what we essentially do is we pull this content, these requirements documents down from BSI, and then we can open them to see, what is the content of the document? Is it something that's interesting to me that I want to have in Polarian or not? If the answer is yes, what it does is it breaks those individual clauses down into their atomic content. And then what we do is we import it into Polarian. And so we have this library, you select the document that's important to you, and then it brings it into the external standards library in Polarian and has it broken down into its atomic elements, each clause separately traceable. And that's really the front end of the process that makes this whole thing so much easier. So again, we have this normative library, and I'm just going to show you a couple reports that make this so much more powerful. So at the normative library level, what we want to be able to do is share these documents down to projects with their component requirements in them. And so what this report does is it grabs all of the reports that are in the normative library that are shared down to different projects. And so this is just one example of that, where we have this design verification test document and it's been shared to a new project. It shows not only that it's been shared, but what approved version it was shared at. So what we're showing here are only approved versions. So inside of Polarian, I can take a document and I can save it and save it and save it again. But what I'm really concerned about in this particular report is what are the revisions of the documents that have been approved as versions, and what is the historical version of that document that is that version. So I'm going to share that version, approved version number 1, down to a project, but I don't want to see all the trash in the middle. I just want to see the ones that are approved. So this report takes all that into account. So I can just look at this report, say in my normative library, I have 250 documents that have been shared down to projects. Here's where the project they were shared, one or many, hundreds of them if necessary, and all the revision levels of each one that was shared. Now you can imagine how hard that is to do, because these normative libraries are going to be changing at a rate that's even faster than the external standards, because we're going to be making adjustments to how we want to handle this for new projects that are coming out. Those normative libraries are going to be changing all the time. Well, I need to understand, was it shared with version 1 or version 75? And so when I go to make an adjustment based on the external standard, I understand what changes were made between those versions. So all of this reporting, this sort of documents in revision depth, is really important. So the next thing is the project standard library. So not only do I want to view down to the projects of what was shared, but I also want to know from the project up what has been shared from a library. And what this report does is say, what are all the different normative library documents that have been shared down to this project? What revision were they shared? Where were they shared from? What was the name of the document they were shared from? All of the information. And how was it shared? Was it derived? Was it branched? And what project did it come out of? What project was it shared into? What space was it shared into in the project? So all of this information, so that I can click on a box and literally be able to pull down a new revision of the document anytime that I want to. But very importantly, I don't have to pull it down until it makes sense to the project. So for example, when I have a sterilization standard and I want to share a new version of a sterilization standard down to the project, I only want to do that on a cadence when I'm revalidating the sterilization. I don't want to do it a month after the last validation cycle happened. I want to do it at the end of the year when I'm going to revalidate it anyway. So we really want to be in a position where the requirements in the normative library don't impact the project until the project's ready for it. I think that's a really important distinction in how this should be deployed, so we understand better how to control the projects. And this is just a little bit more detail. We have this design inputs. It was shared from the main library in these different revisions, and we actually can click on each one of these. So we could click on the norms 2, the version 1.0.1, and the version that's the head version in the library, and do a differential and see what the red line is between them. So super powerful tool to be able to compare those different requirements documents. Okay, so this is kind of how it goes. We have the external standard library that's broken down by clause. We trace those atomically to the normative company standard. Those are then shared to the project standard as documents and containers of work items. And then we can show this traceability between the external standard and the project standard to show we assured the compliance of a project to each one of the standards. Very important. So we have this partnership with BSI and client partners. If you're a client partner that wants to be involved in this development activity, please let me know and I'll be happy to include you. We value your feedback and we'd want to bake into the application the kind of use case that would be interesting to you. So just to finish up here, what's the value of design control reuse? First off, it's just demonstration of compliance. If we have an audit, I can show for any product line compliance of a project with an external standard very quickly. It's a super rapid way to increase the confidence that the regulatory bodies have in the way we do our development work. And I guess I just asked, how do you currently show compliance with external standards? Usually this is a very manual process. This new method is about 5 minutes. You double click and pull up the report. Just have to know which project and which standard we're concerned with. And I think one of the biggest values in all of this is reuse. I would say that's true for requirements management in general. Anything related to requirements management. Reuse is the knob by which we justify these programs. And I've seen reuse of requirements, reuse, and I say as much as 94%. I've now seen projects over 95% reuse, where not only do we get the kind of labor improvement that's associated with that, but also the quality of the requirements goes up because we're constantly churning on those requirements to make sure they're written in a way that makes sense to that product type. So very important. More typical maybe reuse is probably in that 60-70% range, but I mean, you can imagine how much money this saves if you get a good process. You can reuse the test cases as well. Risk management is also a possibility. And as I said before, the quality of these things gets so much better because the data is vetted on previous projects rather than just being developed whole cloth. So if you have any need for pairing templates around this, I'd be happy to help. So this is my information once again. Please feel free to forward this design control registration link to folks, and I'd be happy to get them a link to the next session, and jump on my YouTube channel, or feel free to email or call me. So we'd love to